On today's show, I will be grading the New York Mets trade deadline assets this offseason.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, I thought it'd be a fun show today to look at the Mets trade assets as we head into the offseason and give them grades. Who's not going to be traded, who could be dealt, even though it's unlikely. And then of the players who really could be on the move, the Mets are trying to address their roster via the trade market. Who's the most valuable trade chip that the Mets have? And how can they put together a package that could, appeal to teams? Let's just say maybe, I don't know, the Padres for Juan Soto. So we're going to get to all of that. In the first segment, though, let's just look at the guys that probably aren't moving. So who are the building blocks of the New York Mets right now? Francisco Lindor has the contract that tells you he's a building block, as does Brandon Nimmo and Edwin Diaz. Kodai Senga, a building block currently. He does have an opt-out potentially after year 3, but for now, he's on a 5-year deal and heading into year 2 of it. He can be considered a building block, as is Francisco Alvarez at this point. I think he is the starting catcher of the New York Mets. So those 5 guys are your current building blocks. With that said, there's still Pete Alonso, who could be a building block, but he's set to hit free agency after this season. So there is still something there where we can't just call him a clear building block. I want to get into his trade value in a second here. First, though, let's just get to the list of guys who won't be traded this offseason. Starling Marte, that contract has become more of an albatross than a help. Teams are not going to be willing to take him on unless the Mets eat a considerable amount of money or give up prospects with him. At this point, you're better off just seeing if he can bounce back next season. Jose Quintana provides too much value in an area that the Mets need. At the deadline, yes, there could be trade value if the Mets aren't in the mix. But for now, he's staying put. Omar Narvaez, assuming he opts into that player option, doesn't have a ton of trade value, and the Mets need a backup catcher. He'll stay put. And then the bullpen arms, you're not going to get much by putting Drew Smith on the trade market. Okay, that's not going to do much for you. Colin Holderman got the Daniel Vogelback, the deadline in 2022, but we're just going to table all bullpen arms. So now we get back to the Pete Alonso conversation. What type of a Pete Alonso trade makes sense? He's a tier 1 asset. I'm going to get into my tier system in the next segment about how I'm grading these assets. But he is as good of a player as could be had in a trade. But what trade makes sense? If the Mets are still trying to win in 2024, I really don't know what trade really would appetize them. At the deadline, if they were out of it, again, different conversation. Maybe he is flipped to get some prospects. But right now, unless you're trading for another big name, I don't think it makes sense. And even then, which of those trades work? You're going to trade Pete Alonso for Corbin Burns? I don't know necessarily why either team would want to do that. To lose Burns if the Brewers are going for it, that's going to hurt them too much. And also, what's Alonso and expiring doing for them in that last year? There's a fun Pete Alonso for Tyler Glasnow trade that sends Alonso back to the Rays, and the Rays had to send more on top of it as far as prospects, but that's never going to happen. There is a pie in the sky Pete Alonso Juan Soto thing, but I think I'll get to that at a later date, and probably if I'm talking to my boy Javi Reyes with Locked On Padres. Bottom line, I don't see it happening. So then we get to the last guy who I think has some real trade value that I actually could see moved. He's my under-the-radar trade asset, and that's Jeff McNeil on a 4-year, $50 million contract. He just made $6.25 million in year 1. There's $41.75 million over the next 3 years. The AAV on the contract for luxury tax teams is $12.5 million, so he could fit on any contending team. Now, he has a $2 million buyout on a $15.75 million option for an additional year, which is what gets that number up to the $50 million guaranteed that he got. But if you look at it overall, again, next 3 years, a guy that's going to be getting paid, less than, what is that if you break that down? Less than 14? Yeah, a little bit less than $14 million per season for a team that would acquire him. That's a value contract still. I know he had a down year, but I think there's teams that would sign up for a guy that won a batting title a year ago, who's a career 298 hitter, who can play pretty much every position on the field. No one's going to start him at shortstop or at center field, but a guy that can play left, right, and second really well, can play third base in a pinch. And again, in rare circumstances, you could throw him out in center, you could throw him at short, throw him at first base. He did that this past season. I think there's a lot of value for Jeff McNeil. And it's not to say that you're going to, get some incredible return. You're not getting Juan Soto with Jeff McNeil. But actually, that's a great example. In a Juan Soto trade, Jeff McNeil would hold some value to a team like the Padres that's still trying to win, who's trying to cut some salary. They might have too many guys like it with Jay Cronenworth and Hae-Sung Kim. But the point being, you could move Jeff McNeil and get something pretty surprising. Like you could move Jeff McNeil and get that starting pitcher in your rotation. He's not going to be the one piece that gets you a tier one asset coming back, but I'd call Jeff McNeil a fringe tier two asset. And that's what I want to explain a little bit more in the next segment here, my tier system, because I have put tiers that all these guys fall into and how that relates to the trade market. So we'll get to that and some other players on the MLB roster next. Before we do, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The NFL season in full swing. Now the NBA season has tipped off. So every single night, there's something that you can put a little bit of action on. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including the spread, player props, over-unders, and more. If you're tuning in on a Thursday night, you want to watch some Thursday night football, you can bet the spread, the over-under. You can bet on who's going to score the first touchdown. There's a lot that you can play. Or, of course, you got the NBA season. You want to bet on points, rebounds, assists. You want to parlay a couple of guys' stats together on your favorite team, plus your team winning the game. You could have a great night if your favorite basketball team goes off for you. So if you want to play, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. If you have any questions about my trade tiers that we're about to get into, feel free to reach out to me as a Locked On Mets insider via subtext. This is a really exciting new plan we have going on. It's been a lot of fun to get to know some of you Locked On Mets insiders that have already subscribed. Basically, it's a one-on-one texting service. You can text me questions, comments, whenever you like, and I can respond back. You also get the text message updates that I send to all of the Locked On Mets insiders, whether there's a rumor that's out there, a news item to discuss, or if I'm just prepping for the following day's show and I have some interesting stat I want to share. It's been a lot of fun to get to know some of you better through subtext. So again, find that link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/lockedonmets. Now, I just called Jeff McNeil a tier 2 trade asset. What does that mean? I created a tier system for this. I thought, am I going to do grades? But then do you get into A, B minus, C plus, all that stuff? Instead, I went with tiers. So it's a 5-tier system. Tier 5 is negative assets. Okay. Assets like Starling Marte, tier 5. You're probably not going to trade a tier 5 player. Tier 4 is barely positive assets, right? Tradable players that are throw-ins, but you're not getting much for them. The perfect example of a tier 4 trade is Matt Harvey for Devin Mesorasko years ago. Harvey looked awful off of all of those injuries. Devin Mesorasko was just a catcher with a little bit of pop who didn't have much left in the tank. You swapped him. That's a tier 4 trade. Tier 3. These are players that aren't going to necessarily get you the tier 1, but you can get another team's tier 3 at a different position of need if there's something like that where you trade from a surplus for another team's surplus, or they can start to move the needle for a tier one. If you threw multiple tier 3 players in there, maybe you combine them with a tier 1 or a tier 2 asset, and you can get towards that tier 1 type talent. So that's the general basis of my tier system. And as we go through it, it'll make more sense. Tier 2 are real trade value pieces that start conversations. So Jeff McNeil, for the right team that's trying to contend, that looks at his contract as a really valuable asset because he's going to be an above average starter for you for the next 3 years under an affordable number who can play multiple positions, plug multiple holes. That makes him a tier 2 trade asset. Other teams would really be intrigued to acquire Jeff McNeil. It had to be the right team. There's some teams that wouldn't be interested, but I bet you there's a few out there that would really love a chance. And the reason why you trade Jeff McNeil, since I didn't completely land this plane in the last segment, the reason why you would trade him, I don't think it's necessarily something that I would advise, but if there actually is a clubhouse issue, so to speak, if there is, a vibe that needs to be changed in that clubhouse, if there's one guy to extract from the mix, it's so funny that people, on sports talk radio in New York are looking at Pete Alonso as the guy to pull from the equation. The guy that makes more sense would be Jeff McNeil. He's not under a contract like Nimmo or Lindor that has him on your team for the better part of the next decade. He's not coming off a season as good as those guys either, where you really want to keep them at premier positions. He's a guy that plugs so many holes for your roster that I think he's more valuable to keep, but also that gives him some value on the market. And if you're trying to just change things, I would not be completely stunned if it happened. I'd certainly be surprised, but if Jeff McNeil's moved this offseason, I'd be like, okay, I can follow that line of thinking. Now let's look at the rest of the players on this MLB roster. We'll get to the trade throw-ins. These are guys that aren't tier 5. They're not negative trade assets, but they don't have a lot of value. I spoke about a couple of them earlier this week. Louis Guillorme, DJ Stewart, guys that could be non-tendered. If they are tendered and you're in a trade discussion as a throw-in, there's a little bit of value there. And I'd say the same thing with Tyler McGill, Jose Budo, and Joey Lucchesi. McGill and Budo are a little bit closer to a tier 3. They haven't done enough where I think teams are going to be really enamored by the possibility. But as part of a bigger package, you throw in starting pitchers with control, and teams are going to be open to it, I would say, and it would move the needle slightly. Now we go to high upside, bad season. Guys that still have a ceiling that is going to intrigue teams, but are coming off a year that really damaged their trade value. We start with David Peterson. So Peterson is somewhere between a tier 4 and a tier 3. For the right team, he's a tier 3 asset. He's a guy that they might look at as a reclamation project that they would love to get their hands on because his pitch data, despite the fact that he had horrible numbers for a large part of this season, he still has a really good slider. And teams are going to see that and think we can be the one that fixes him. And that makes him a tier 3 in some respects. Mark Vientos, another tier 3 right now. Now, for the right team, maybe viewed as a tier 2. For the right team that sees his bat potential, sees the way that he can really get into baseballs and drive them with high exit velocities, they might love Mark Vientos. But if Mark Vientos was really a tier 2 asset, I think he probably would have been traded over the last 48, geez. I was thinking of 2 days. The last 48 hours. No, last 2 years, last 24 months. Like there might have been a trade at some point during the 2021 deadline. If they could have traded Mark Vientos instead of Pete Crow Armstrong for Javi Baez, for example, they would have done that, but they couldn't. 2022 deadline, 2022 offseason. If he had more trade value, I think he probably would have been sent out because of him being an ill-fitting piece on this roster. So I think he's more tier 3. Brett Baty, the last guy that falls under this high upside off a bad season. I still think he's tier 2. I do. He was a tier 1 trade asset going into last year. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I think for just baseball, we had him fringe top 10. Maybe he was in our top 20 for our top 100 prospects. And he was a consensus top 100 prospect. That moves the needle. That really does. Okay. For example, Luisangel Acuna was a tier 1 trade asset as a consensus top 100 prospect that netted you a tier 1 asset when you had all of the money that was tied into it in Max Scherzer. Like that was a trade where 1 for 1, high upside, those guys were dealt. So Brett Baty could have been in those conversations before this season, but he played so bad he sort of played himself out of that top tier. There's still some teams that will look past it and would love Brett Beatty. But I think, for the Mets, they're better off holding on to him and seeing what he has next season. Because I think, if nothing else, he'll improve that trade value. But really, I still believe at this moment in time, I know there's a lot of Mets fans that don't, I still think he's the third baseman of the future. So going through all those guys, most likely to be moved from that list, I think you're looking at, Peterson, McGill, Budo, guys that might have some value in a larger trade. Vientos, definitely. And then, like I said, I threw out the McNeil, the Beatty. I think those guys, there is a chance, but I'd still be fairly surprised that they were dealt. The prospects is where this conversation really gets even more interesting because those are always the pieces that a team that's trying to contend, and I still think the Mets fit that category, those are the pieces they're going to want to deal. But there's some prospects that you are holding on to with both hands and you consider untouchable. So we'll get to some of those guys next. First, though, another word from our sponsors. For everyone that is watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're trying to make a push to get to 10,000 subs. We just crossed over 7,000 this week. So I appreciate all of you who hit that subscribe. Now, this is where it gets really fun. We're going to look at the Mets farm system and the prominent names and who has the most trade value. We're going to begin with the untouchable tier ones in this system. To me, there's two that are untouchable right now. There's other guys that I don't want to see the Mets move, but I'd be open to when, I don't know, there's a generational talent who maybe plays for the Padres. Juan Soto? Yeah, I'd be open to it. So really, this is where the conversation starts to get framed in that direction. And tomorrow's show, assuming there's no news that gets in the way of it, we're going to be doing another Juan Soto trade episode. I want to compare him to Bryce Harper. I think I did this actually. Now that I'm literally remembering back. I did this at the deadline. And in 2022, but it bears repeating because the Mets can't miss this opportunity. So we'll get to that on tomorrow's show. Looking at the pieces that could be moved, the two that I'm not sending out is Jett Williams and Drew Gilbert. Those are the two untouchables in the Mets system right now for me. If I re-rank the top 10, that's my 1 and 2. I'm not quite sure the order at this time. I'd really have to think about it. Drew Gilbert, he's their best outfield prospect. You can't move him right now. He's too valuable for a team that really has a lot of question marks long-term in the outfield. So Drew Gilbert, to me, you got to hang on to him. He's also potentially going to be at the big league level this upcoming season if he can have a good start to the 2024 campaign. Another guy who theoretically could do that is Jett Williams, though. Now, Williams, it's less likely because he doesn't have nearly as much playing time in Double-A. He'll be 20 next year. They can play it a little bit slower on him, but he also might just force their hand because he was giving, the best at bats in the system by the end of the year. He was just unbelievable. And if I'm not mistaken, he was their player of the year as well. I'm not trading Jett Williams if I'm David Stearns. I'm hanging on to him and I'm looking at him as the second baseman of the future. So that gets me to the tradable tier one assets the Mets have. Luisangel Acuna and Ryan Clifford are the two that I put in that top tier, guys that could open the doors to trade for any player in baseball. And guys that I actually would move. I wouldn't move both of them for Juan Soto on a 1-year deal, but I'd move one of the two. And I think Luisangel Acuna would really excite the Padres, a guy that they could conceivably, as a team that rushes a lot of their prospects, plug into the lineup as soon as next season and go. He could be their center fielder potentially if they wanted to go that route with, a laundry list of shortstops already on the roster with Hae-Sung Kim and Xander Bogaerts. And if you wanted to call Machado shortstop, you could, but he's obviously just playing third for them. But of course, Fernando Tatis Jr. could always slide back into that shortstop position as well. Acuna has the athleticism to go play center field. I think they'd like him. So he's a piece that I think is not necessarily one that I'd be floating by any stretch. But if you have to give to get, I'd prefer the Mets to trade Acuna, who just got into the system, than Jett Williams, who they drafted, who's younger, who I think has more upside at this point. So that's where I'm at between Williams and Acuna. Ryan Clifford, look, he hit a ton of home runs this year. When they made the trade originally, I was more excited, the Verlander trade that is, I was more excited about the power potential of Clifford than it was over Gilbert as my gut reaction to it. Gilbert was clearly the better prospect, but the upside on Clifford had me tantalized. Then he struggled after the trade. Not that that kills his prospect value by any stretch, but it gave me some pause. And then Gilbert was amazing in Double A, and that really sort of solidified the difference there. With Clifford, there's still a level of unknown where I'd be willing to trade him because he does strike out a lot and he doesn't have a clear position yet. But he also has the type of power that other teams would, be really excited about. So those are the two tradable tier 1 prospects. Now we get to the list of tier 2. And the two that I call nearly untouchable out of the tier 2, and it's because of the lack of pitching this farm system has developed. They're getting a lot better lately, but still, when's the last time they developed a really good starting pitcher? You have to go back to the whole Zach Wheeler, Jacob deGrom, Steven Matz, Matt Harvey, that whole era, Noah Syndergaard. They haven't had a great one since. David Peterson had his moments, but I mean, where is he right now? So, nearly untouchable tier 2s, Blade Tidwell, Christian Scott. And that's because of their frontline stuff. I think that those are the two guys they have right now. If they were to have a top of the line starting pitcher waiting in the wings, it's one of those guys. So I would not trade him this offseason. Now we get to the tradable tier 2. Kevin Parada, Ronnie Mauricio, Colin Houck, Marco Vargas, Mike Vassell, and I threw Brandon Sproat in there as well. Brandon Sproat, they just drafted, high octane arm. We don't really know yet on him. And Colin Houck is the same thing. They just drafted him, which is why I'd also be open to trading them. I mean, obviously, you value your scouting, and if you love these guys, and I'd honestly be pretty apprehensive to trade Houck. But if, again, you're on the phone with Preller on Soto, and that's the deal breaker, he wants Houck, not Acuna, well, you hang on to Acuna, you throw Houck in the deal. But again, I don't think Houck would be traded. I don't think that Sprout would be traded either. Now, Marco Vargas, they just got on the David Robertson deal. I don't know how much teams love him, but if there's a team out there that loves him, that makes him tradable. I could see it. Mike Vassell is in AAA. I think he's going to be a starting pitcher in the big leagues, but I do wonder what that ceiling is. Is the ceiling a number 3, number 4, middle of the rotation, back of the rotation arm? That's still extremely valuable, and that's why other teams would want to trade for him. But I don't think that makes him untradeable by any stretch, even with the lack of pitching that has been developed and gotten up to the big leagues that I described before there. Mauricio and Parada, those guys I'm curious about. Kevin Parada, because you have Francisco Alvarez, it makes him more expendable. There's still questions about if he can catch at the big league level. He's currently in the Arizona Fall League right now. If he makes a name for himself there, yeah, I could see that as a piece that is moved and that would have a lot of value. I don't think he's quite tier 1 because of the season he just had, but hey, if he starts off great next year, he could really improve that trade value. And Ronnie Mauricio, while he looked good in flashes, look at his complete numbers last year with the Mets. They weren't as great as people remember them to be, who just saw those stolen bases and the big exit velocities. There's still a lot of question marks with Ronnie Mauricio. I still think he's one of the players that they would absolutely deal. And I think he would move the needle a little bit as a tier 2 asset. Tier 3, Alex Ramirez. I don't even know if he's there at this point. He was so bad this season. It'd be very hard to trade him. Had to be a team that loved him before this past year. Dominic Hamill, it feels bad to actually include him in the same tier as Alex Ramirez, honestly. I feel like Ramirez should probably be tier 4 if I'm looking back on my notes here. But Dominic Hamill, Tyler Stewart, Joander Suarez, Justin Jarvis, Coleman Crow, all those guys are pitchers. We saw like the typical tier 3 trade. Here's a great example. Justin Jarvis traded for Mark Hanna this year. That's tier 3. Okay. A prospect that is decent, but not incredible that the Mets got. And Mark Hanna, a rental bat who could help you. I mean, he actually has that club option. We're waiting to see if the Brewers pick it up, but you get the picture I'm trying to paint here. Those are all arms that in the right deal, I'd be fine with the Mets moving. I think they're probably going to try to hang on to all the arms they can at this point, but they do bear mentioning as prominent pitchers who have made their way up to AA. Jeremiah Jackson needs to be protected on the 40-man roster, which could also make him a little more expendable. as far as trading him this offseason. If you didn't feel like he's going to contribute to the Mets in the next 2 years, which I think he's close enough that he probably could, but maybe you don't want to waste a roster spot on him. Maybe you add him and then trade him later this offseason and clear that spot back up when you make later signings. I like him a lot, though. I'd rather see the Mets hang on to him. Now, to close here, most likely to be moved in a star trade, which will lead into tomorrow's show, where I will put together a package on Juan Soto again. A more aggressive package, might I add, because I think there's going to be a market that's going to develop for Juan Soto with teams like the Yankees and the Cubs all circling. And with that, you might have to throw a more lucrative package together than you would have liked for a player on a 1-year deal at this point who's a rental, but it's about getting him in and then trying to extend him. That's the whole purpose of it. So here are the most likely to be moved in a star trade: Luisangel Acuna, Ryan Clifford, tier 1. Tier 2, Kevin Parada, Ronnie Mauricio, Mike Vassell. Tier 3, Mark Vientos is the most likely, and pick any one of these other arms. But those are the most likely to be moved in a star trade this offseason, in my opinion. Thank you all for tuning into the show today. I hope you appreciated the tier system that I came up with for this. If you have any questions about it, you can feel free to comment if you're watching on YouTube, or become a Locked On Mets insider. You find a link in the description, or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. You can also follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Subscribe on YouTube, follow wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for a little more Juan Soto talk.